And if you take a look around the country, there's only 12 states where the superintendent of the schools is elected. And in those 12 states, nearly half of them rank in the top 10% of the worst school districts in the country. So we can see better results, better student achievement in states where they have the DPI superintendent treated more as a cabinet post. And I think that's because you have more accountability between the superintendent, the governor, and the legislature.
But I guess the one difference here is that we are routinely one of the higher ranked states for education, right? I mean, this has not been an issue here in Wisconsin.
Well, if you take a look at our numbers, I'm not satisfied with them, and I know many in my caucus are not. I mean, we can barely get 37% of the students in our school system to read proficiently, and that proficiency bar is not all that high. If you look at our graduation rates, we're one of only 9 states that has seen a decline in graduation in the last 10 years. So while things have improved slightly, we've largely remained stagnant over the last decade, and I think it's time for change.
The governor's, and what he's saying on the campaign trail, I know that you have nothing to do with that, but he talks all the time about how graduation rates are up, ACT scores are up. Are you saying that that isn't true?
No, I think that's true. If you look just within the last 1 or 2 school years, they're up slightly. As a state government, one of the most important jobs we have is educating our children, our workforce for the future, and making sure they have an education that they're going to be able to go out and get good family-supporting jobs and support themselves. And for many of our children living in our larger urban areas, we see a large disparity, racial disparity between the graduation gaps, the reading scores, the math scores, and over the last several decades, DPI, in my opinion, has just been willing to sit back and accept that as, well, this is the best we can do, and I don't buy that. I think it's time for us to stop taking their excuses and start demanding results. We owe it to the kids, we owe it to the teachers to have a school system that puts more authority and more power at the local level, and that's best going to be achieved by going through a cabinet post.
Well, that's the question that I was going to ask you next, was that do you think that your impression of this is at all skewed because you're a representative from West Dallas, and I know the public schools there maybe aren't as high as maybe some other places, and the same with the Milwaukee School District. People in where I am in Madison, or maybe outwards in the state, in either the central part or the northern part of the state, may have a different impression. Do you think that's fair?
Well, if you take a look at, you talked about Madison. If you take a look at the Madison public school system, you have about a 71% graduation rate last year, system-wide. But when you look at just African-American students, that's down to 58%. And those are very sad and pathetic numbers. And there's no reason why we should accept that status quo and think that we cannot do any better. I believe we can do any better, and by treating the Department of Public Instruction just like the Department of Health Services or the Department of Transportation or every other department, that brings more accountability in to the head of that department, to the governor and the legislature, where we can start demanding that we get better results.
So if it is something that is appointed by the governor and maybe the legislature has more input on, what changes do you see being made that would improve some of the statistics you're mentioning?
Well, I think you're going to see a more cohesive agency. In the past, the governor and the legislature has tried to make improvements and make some changes into the school systems, and the superintendent, and I want to be clear, this isn't just about the current superintendent. This goes back for many, many decades. But the superintendents in the past have at times rebuffed what the legislature and the governor had tried to do. Now, as the elected legislature and governor, we are responsible to the citizens to make sure that the services that they provide, that they rely on their government to provide them, is being provided in the best way possible. We also are the ones that, in the end, charge them the tax money that pay for these services. Yet we have a separate elected DPI superintendent who uses the Constitution as a crutch to prop up his department and blame all the failures on the legislature, when in fact the legislature does not have a lot of control because he's doing things his way.
Do you think, he talked when we spoke to him this past week about the fact that, look, in 1848, they made a conscious decision in the Constitution to say this should be a separately elected office. Does this speak at all to checks and balances, where I know you're saying the legislature doesn't have as much control, but is that necessarily a bad thing? Does this not provide more of a check and balance that you have a separate office?
Well, I don't know how you get checks and balances when you have the legislature that clearly has the authority to set education policy. The Constitution says that the superintendent is in a supervisory role, so he's supposed to be carrying out the statutes and the rules set by the legislature and the governor, but he tends not to do that. And again, he relies on the Constitution as his crutch to do so. And every time something comes along that the superintendent or the DPI folks don't like, they right away run to the Constitution and say, oh my gosh, you know, you can't tell us what to do. We're in charge of our own agency. Yet the citizens of this state depend on the legislature and the governor for all the other services that are provided. And I think for a more cohesive form of government, that we're better off to treat this as a cabinet post. And again, I just go back to the facts. Out of the 12 states that elect the superintendent, 5 of them are in the top 10 failing worst school districts in the country. And when you look at the achievements of students, the students are doing better.
Can you point out to me where specifically they have said we're not going to carry out the will of the legislature and we're going to use the Constitution to maybe block that?
Well, I think right now you have a court case going on that's up at the state Supreme Court level that talks about rulemaking authority and the fact that the legislature wants things to be done in a certain way, and the superintendent has said, I don't have to do that, and I don't have to ask you how I'm running things because I'm separately elected. If you take a look at some of the other programs that the legislature has put in place, the superintendent, when he doesn't like those programs, will reluctantly, in some cases, follow those programs, but create all sorts of rules that are over and above what the statutes clearly call for. And that's the case we're seeing in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. And we have, again, this isn't just something new, and with this superintendent, this has been an ongoing thing for the last several decades. And the superintendent himself has used the exact term several times publicly that I'm an independently elected official, you can't tell me what to do.
Can I ask you, going forward, you said that you're going to have other plans and proposals to cut the power of DPI. What are we going to expect to see in forms of legislation?
Yeah, you know, in the next few weeks, we're going to be rolling out some other bills. We've been working on them for about the last 6 or 8 months. And basically, what I want to do is I want to decentralize the authority from Madison and put that authority back in the school districts. I don't believe when it comes to education that a one-size-fits-all process is best. You know, what works for my school districts in West Allis and New Berlin may not work, you know, in Milwaukee or in Madison or in other areas. So I think that we're best off to let that decision-making be done at the local level. It's the local folks that know best what their teachers and what their students need in order to learn.
You know, we've heard a lot from the other side as far as Tony Evers is concerned, and a lot of teachers and school officials talking about the fact that they don't have as much local control since Republicans came into power in 2011. And part of that, they pointed, is the expansion of school choice. We saw a school in Milwaukee just this past week closed down after 2 weeks. Is that the right way forward in your mind?
Well, it's important to remember, too, that that school that you're speaking of in Milwaukee closed down after it was kicked out of the program. So there are processes that are in place to make sure that if there is a failing school, it's dealt with and it's gone. But you talk about failing schools in Milwaukee. We've had over 50 failing MPS schools year after year after year, yet nothing is done by DPI to shut those schools down or to reorganize them. In fact, we have, I think I read at least 5 schools in the city of Milwaukee where children are reading at a 6% proficiency level, and there's at least 1 school where not a single child in the school is reading at proficiency. So for all the arrows that are slung at our voucher schools, when they are not performing properly, they're closed down. But that same accountability is not put forth in public education. And I'm a firm believer that we need strong public schools, charter schools, and private schools to match the needs of all of the kids in our state. There's not one size that's going to fit all. I have a couple in West Allis that are not doing real well. But yet DPI has taken the position that, well, you know, this is the best we can do in some of those neighborhoods. They're impoverished areas. They come from difficult family situations. I'm not going to take those excuses anymore. I'm going to demand results, because you know what? If we're ever going to break this cycle of poverty that we're having in these larger urban areas, we've got to get these kids a good education so that they can go out and they make more money getting a job with the better education. And that's what I'm hoping to achieve by this change.
All right, Representative Joe Sanfelippo, thanks for joining us from Milwaukee today, and we'll see how those bills progress here in the legislature.